I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Paul Ehrlich, the Bing Professor of Population Studies Emeritus and President of the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford. He's the author and co-author of more than 1,100 scientific papers and articles and over 40 books, including the 1968 bestseller, The Population Bomb, co-authored with his wife, Anne. Dr. Ehrlich is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and a foreign member of the Royal Society. Among his many other honors is the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and being awarded the Crafoord Prize. He's appeared on over 1,000 TV and radio programs and was a correspondent for NBC News. Paul joins us today to discuss the causes, consequences, and possible solutions to overpopulation. So, Paul, welcome. It is truly an honor to have you with us today, sir.
Nice to be here.
So let me start out with The Population Bomb. You achieved international notoriety by publishing that back in 1968. So let me start by asking, what led you to that initial awareness of the issue back then and inspired yourself and Anne to write the book?
Well, the original, the earliest thing was that I was a butterfly collector. And in the late 1940s, when I was a college student, particularly, I was watching natural habitat for butterflies being paved over, turned into huge housing developments. And I found that I could not raise butterflies in my New Jersey home, monarch butterflies, because so much DDT was being sprayed around that they were being wiped out. And the crowding was obvious in those days to everybody. We had many discussions of that. I was fortunate to go to college with the last of the World War II veterans, so that they beat me up when I had the idea of joining a fraternity or doing something really juvenile like that. And we had many, many discussions of the world situation, of the possibilities for nuclear war, of the amount of overpopulation and what that meant. So I saw overpopulation at home in terms of crowding and destruction of natural habitat. And then Anne and I traveled around the world and saw the poverty and the fact that we were not able to come close to taking care of all the human beings we already had on the planet. And all that led to the population bomb. But the time was ripe because the scientific community as a whole was getting nervous about it. There was discussion in the scientific community. And finally, in early 1990s, the national academies of virtually every country got together and said, we have a really serious population problem. And if we don't do something about it, we're basically finished. And interestingly, that was 25 years ago, roughly. And 25 years after it, about 15,000 scientists signed on to the second version of this statement. So the population bomb was early, but it wasn't unique, but it did attract a lot of attention and gave me an opportunity to blab on TV. And I'm a born blabber.
Well, so critics of The Population Bomb have called the book alarmist and noted that the mass starvation that you initially predicted never came to pass. But others have said that the book helped to prevent this tragedy by raising awareness and inspiring positive action. So what are your thoughts on that? I guess I could see aspects of both there.
I would say that the specific predictions that I made in The Population Bomb mostly were in the form of scenarios and clearly stated to be little stories about the future that won't happen, but will help you think about it. On the other hand, I'm always cheered by those people who say that the starvation never happened, because it didn't happen in the form that the agriculturalists I was quoting expected, but millions of people died of starvation between the population bomb and today mostly children. It's still going on. There's increasing concern now in even the popular media about the world food situation and what it means. But one of the things that everybody has to remember is it's something on the order of 2 billion people don't have diets that allow them to function fully as human beings, and that tens of millions die every year from hunger and hunger-related disease. And of course, what we're doing to the rest of the planet is making our ability to feed people less and less every day, not every year.
Yeah, yeah. Well, back when you wrote the population bomb, the global population was at 3.5 billion. So today we're at 8 billion people, and the United Nations is projecting a peak of around 10.4 billion during the 2080s. It seems like population growth is slowing. Could you interpret that as saying that people are starting to get the message?
I think various things are affecting that. Partly they're starting to get the message. Partly they're wanting, when Ann and I traveled around the world, for instance, everybody didn't already have a cell phone. So that the world is changing so that people's desires are changing, and women faced with whether they want to have a third child or a motorcycle, choose the motorcycle. So things are changing. And also, as we see today in Iran, the women are slowly but surely getting the power they deserve. In other words, one of the things that always impressed me that Ann and I have always talked about is the first thing you want to do, if you want to humanely change the population size, is give women full rights, full opportunities, and so on, something which we haven't done yet in any country. I mean, one of the disgraces in the United States is that the Republican war on women is one of the great things they're doing in the war on humanity and destroying humanity. And they start out by attacking the women.
Yeah,
and in Iran, we're seeing the women are coming back.
I read about that. So what you're describing is, I believe, what they call demographic transition, and it's a slowdown of population growth due to a change of lifestyle, right? Partly from agricultural to industrialized society. And it is interesting. I've read that women's rights and education are one of the fundamental foundations of demographic transition, where when you give people the education and the choice to make better decisions about their family size, they make better decisions. So it sounds like that reinforces it.
Well,
Now,
that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Another approach was China's overpopulation issue. They went towards the one-child policy. This was many years ago. And as I understand things, it did reduce population growth, but it also had some unintended consequences. So is that something that's feasible? Is it workable? Or should we just pray that demographic transition does the job for us?
Well, no, praying for the demographic transition is not unhappily the way to do it. I'm not saying that the Chinese way was either, but the Chinese, first of all, and I have actually met the Chinese engineer who designed the entire program, and it had some unhappy side effects, not the least of which, for example, was people choosing to abort female fetuses more than male because they, for some insane reason, from my point of view, prefer having boys over girls. I've always had the other point of view for some reason. But the Chinese broadcast, and they talked about the errors they were making, and they did things to change it. They had an entire program on valuing girls and so on. So it wasn't the horror show that people think. And of course, it helped China to reduce its overpopulation or its population growth. Still not far enough. The Chinese are now designing what their plans are is to destroy the world by paving it and putting automobiles on it with their program connecting Europe and China. But at least the Chinese looked at the problem and tried to do something about it, unlike the United States, where the Republicans looked at the problem and tried to make it worse and are succeeding. So, well, what can I tell you? Now, my views are not those of Stanford University, unhappily.
Well, so let me jump in. I want to fast forward a little bit to 1972, right? John Calhoun did a mouse experiment that was called the behavioral sink. I actually found this while I was doing research for our interview, in which 8 pairs of mice were introduced into a large box that he called Universe 25. I've seen photos of it. This was a very large, I mean, it measured several feet on a side. And he gave them unlimited food. So within 2 years, the mouse population reached 2,200 mice, but then it steadily declined back down to unrecoverable extinction. I thought this was really interesting because basically, if you hold basically all of the size and volume constraints equal, and you just massively increase the amount of resources they're able to consume, they'll breed out of control. Are people struggling with a similar issue right now?
Well, they are, of course, very different from mice. They control their technologies and their food supply to some degree, but I don't think they're being as smart as mice in most cases, because in natural populations of mice and rats, they do just fine. They operate within the constraints of their ecosystem because they have no choice. The problem today, after all, we have at Stanford University 2 horrible things. One is an economics department, another is a business school, both designed to keep the world perpetually growing until it collapses. But that doesn't mean that every economist is stupid. The smartest, the best economist in the world, Sir Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge University, just completed a huge study for the British government on the economic impacts of the loss of biodiversity of our life support systems. And one of the interesting things that Sir Partha did was calculated what he thought the maximum sustainable population of the planet might be, with knowing what he knew about both economics and ecology. And he came to the conclusion, ironically, that it'd be about 3.5 billion people if everybody was willing to live at somewhat less than a Mexican standard of living. So that tells you, here we are at 8 billion people, with people all now wanting to live at a Hollywood standard of living. And it's just impossible. We are wrecking our capital, as any smart economist even knows, though they don't teach it in their economics departments, and there aren't that many smart ones. But so we're way, way beyond what we can sustain. And the consequences of that are, I think, we'll be very lucky to reach that UN number, because I think that we're set up for a huge increase in the death rates. There's no alternative. You either keep growing and face a huge rise in the death rates, or you humanely try and bring the population down to a size that we can sustain, not for another decade or two, but for another couple million years. If you want a maximum number of people to live, you have to have a sustainable population that stays within the limits of what the planet can support. There are some idiots who think we're going to terraform Mars and move people there. They can't do arithmetic, because, of course, Mars is smaller than the US. So even if you could, smaller than Earth. So if you could somehow miraculously make it a wonderful place to go and move people there, it would be filled up at a faster rate than Earth. There's so much insanity on this issue. You have people, there's a very famous and actually quite clever environmentalist named George Monbiot, who keeps saying the problem is overconsumption, not population. He can't bring himself to grasp the point that the amount of consumption is a function not just of how much each person consumes, but how many people there are. And this is a common point of view, which shows that, among other things, our education system is badly broken. We saw that during the present pandemic.
Yeah, well, and I'd like to come back to that in a few minutes, but so in terms of population itself, and again, the universe 25, to me, it seemed like there might have been some parallels with what we're currently experiencing. Another thing that I wondered about was, could increasing population density, right? Not just the number of people, but again, that's kind of a function of population. Population density is related to that in urban environments and suburbs as well these days. Could that potentially explain behavioral issues like road rage, or maybe even some of the biological challenges that we're seeing, like decreased fertility rates?
There's all sorts of things. This is an extremely complex area where science knows something, but not enough. For example, there's pretty good evidence that sperm counts are dropping. So that one thing that might, quote, solve, end quote, the population problem is infertility. That could happen, although I think not in the time that may be available to us. You got to remember that I shouldn't, but most people don't know that we have come very close to ending the world repeatedly with nuclear weapons. And now that single explosion on that bridge connecting one part of the Ukraine with Russia may well tell us that the end is very, very, very near. Every war game that has been tried has shown that a single use of a nuclear weapon is almost certainly going to lead to a global exchange, and that will clearly end civilization and possibly push humanity to extinction. Scientific community has looked at this. They really don't have an answer. What they do know and say repeatedly is it's absolutely insane to have developed weapons of mass destruction and then threaten each other to use them. The mice didn't have nuclear weapons, and so we can't say for sure what they would have done.
Well, it is interesting though, because, so in the mouse experiments, and that was where I found that they had behavioral changes, there was increase in aggression, and there were decreased fertility rates in the mice in Calhoun's experiment. And so there seemed like there might be parallels. Now, interestingly, in Universe 25, there was also what looked like income inequality, which is where some of the mice took and protected sizable habitats, right? They kind of took more than their share, so to speak, which caused even more overcrowding for the rest. And I was wondering, do you think that might be comparable to the growing wealth gap that's been making headlines recently?
Well, again, I actually, with a colleague in the psychology department, ran some experiments on crowding in human beings, but we unfortunately couldn't do the long term. In other words, we could crowd people and have them do tasks and have them uncrowded doing the tasks. But what's clear is that you would expect all kinds of effects from density, but we have never investigated them. And what we know anecdotally is that people will put up with a huge amount of crowding if they have other things satisfied and are comfortable. We thought, for example, that they would have done experiments on how many people you could crowd into a nuclear submarine. But it turned out, if I recall now, it's a long time ago, what they found was if they had toilets where people could get isolated for a while, that took care of it. You had to have some time you could be by yourself. I thought that people would have done work on how many people you can put in a prison, how many people you can put on a troop ship without having all kinds of, never did it. again, the circumstances, the behavior of the people depended on external circumstances. The Titanic wasn't crowded by most standards, certainly not in the first class areas, but people didn't behave beautifully when it hit the iceberg. So people are very complicated. We need, one of the things that boils me all the time is that you, for instance, you get at Stanford, they've developed a new school for sustainability. It's all basically engineers and geologists, and all the questions for solving it are in the humanities and social sciences, because we scientists know what's happening to the world. What we don't understand is why virtually nobody in power is doing anything about it. You still hear, I know, I met Joe Biden once. Ann and I had a discussion with him in a stairwell in a hotel on Lake Como. And I was very impressed with how bright he was and so on. And yet he still feels constrained to say, we got to keep growth going, when growth is the problem, not the cure.
Yeah.
And it's very depressing to see that the academic community has totally failed to educate people on what's happening in the world. You got to remember, Josh Hawley went to Stanford. Several of the similar idiots went to Harvard. They didn't learn a damn thing. I mean, what can you say? They didn't even learn basic ethics, basic civics. Never mind. I'm raving at you. Didn't mean to.
Well, no, and you're bringing up, maybe I could bring you back for a separate interview on growth, because that's an entirely, that's a topic of its own, to put it mildly. But let me fast forward again to 2013, because this was tied to one of the articles that you sent me. So more recently, you've been looking at, I would say, environmental factors, right? And I think when I considered that, it makes a lot of sense. We have enough food for the most part in terms of agriculture, so we're starting to impact other areas, right? It's like if one piece doesn't give, there are other pieces that are, right up the chain that are going to get strained. In the proceedings of the Royal Society B in 2013, you published, "Can a collapse of global civilization be avoided?" And then you were discussing the damaging effects of climate disruption, as well as overpopulation, overconsumption, depletion of resources, many of the other common themes that you've been talking about for your entire career. And you'd said that these issues reinforce each other and require a collaborative approach to solve. Can you tell me about that a bit?
Well, obviously, a very good example is the food system. At the moment, if the food we are producing now could be distributed equally on the basis of need, so that everybody had the best diet that the world could supply at the moment, nobody would be hungry. So immediately you're into the social sciences. Why aren't we distributing food so that nobody's hungry? Why do we have 2 billion people who are micronutrient malnourished? Then you have the issue that we are wrecking the basic parts of the food system almost as fast as we can. We are exterminating the pollinators that are absolutely critical to the quality of our diets, to say nothing of our economics, because if you wiped out the honeybees in North America, people estimate that would be something on the order of a $20 billion loss. Then the food system is estimated to produce about 35% of the greenhouse gases that are changing the climate, that in turn is wrecking the food system. So the more we eat, the more people there are, the more greenhouse goes into the atmosphere, and the more the planet changes in ways that are not happy for human beings. There's a book called The Ministry for the Future. I can't remember the author's name, but the first chapter would be good reading for anybody who wants to know what likely consequences of climate change are, although you don't have to go that far. In other words, all you have to do is turn on your TV when the newsroom in the incompetent media decides that what they can do for the next week is tell about the problems of the people in Florida after a hurricane.
Yeah.
They are, I have to say, finally mentioning that the intensity of hurricanes is getting worse and will get worse yet because of climate disruption. But they don't give the obvious advice. That is, what should a Floridian do, particularly if you look at their politics? Get the hell out and move to someplace else, particularly if you're a relatively young person, because the combination of hurricanes and sea level rise and idiotic politicians are gradually making Florida a place nobody in their right mind would live. But you don't hear that on the media. They say,
Yeah.
oh, well, we'll put more money into barricades. The oceans can go over any barricade you choose to make.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wanted to highlight was, so after that 2013 paper, that carried enough weight that after you published that, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, responded in agreement with the paper and stated, we do have all the tools, assets, and knowledge to avoid the collapse that this report warns about, but only if we act decisively now. So, do you think that your warning and his reinforcement, did that have positive impact?
I think you have some, everybody says why, and my colleagues all say it is hopeless. And why do you keep doing it? I keep trying to warn people, and I say it's habit, primarily. In other words, I think the odds, and I have no colleague who sees a path to the kind of future I want my great-grandchildren to have. On the other hand, you never know, so you work at it. And he was then Prince Charles. I have admiration for him, also for his dad, who's now gone, but who I spent a very pleasant week with once at a meeting that was duller than hell, but he worked continually to keep it going in the right direction. And we had a chance to drink some beer together on a few occasions and have dinner. And it really, here's a guy who had more money than anybody in the world. He was not constrained by finances, but he took a week off to be in these dull meetings. And there are people like that. One of my, the best alumnus ever to graduate from Stanford University, a guy named Pete Bing, has spent his entire life trying to make the world a better place. He's enormously rich, but he lives a very frugal life. And he puts his money particularly into education and so on, and works very hard at it. When he got he got an MD. Again, the first thing he did was work on an Indian reservation. So there are lots of good people, including good people with a lot of money. There are a lot of idiots with a lot of money too. And you have to judge rich people by the same standards you judge poor people. How do they behave? And some of them do great work, and some of them are just silly or worse. I don't know why I raved at you about that.
Well, yeah, now
I always wanted to experiment with being a billionaire, but I've never quite made it.
So more recently, in fact, just last month, you published Failure of Universities, The Culture Gap is Now Near Lethal. That was co-authored with Joan Diamond, and you guys discussed a failure of the United States and other Western educational systems to prepare for increasing population and technological capabilities of the human race. So that's interesting. I read the article and you were reinforcing, again, these are common themes that you have been talking about for your entire career. And I can't help but wonder, do you think the issue is a lack of education, or is it that people, I've wondered if maybe they just feel overwhelmed, they're not sure what they can do, and it's easier for them to ignore it rather than face the reality of straining our planet's carrying capacity.
Well, I think, again, people, I'll send you another paper sometime, but you got to remember, we are in a freak period in human history. Human history goes back a very long time, something on the order of 200 or 300,000 years. And it's only since the agricultural revolution that we've been able to get enough food so that we could have specialization, which led to the Industrial Revolution, led to science, led to the invention of religions, led to all sorts of things that are brand new in human history. And the answer is, we're a small group animal. We evolved, our biological evolution was as animals that lived in groups of 50 or at most 150 people. And for example, our leaders in those days were the people that were best at something. For instance, the best hunter was the hunt leader. The most compassionate person was the one who led in solving disputes. The doctor was the woman who knew all about the plants that could be used to help with health problems and so on. Now, Donald Trump is the leading liar in the world, but why should he be the leader of a country? We have, first of all, financialized all value so that what you're worth is what your salary is or how much you have put away. Nobody asks why any one person should ever have $42 billion for any reason and why that should translate into any kind of power. So the questions you're asking about are really ones we don't know the answers to, but there should be central to all education, to higher education. What are people for? Why should we give power to people who have money, who may have, for instance, inherited the money, for God's sake? I mean, Trump had something like several $1 million from his old man. A lot of us could get a good start with several $1 million from our old man. So there's just this huge series of questions that, for instance, Stanford University, and I actually talked about this extensively with two of our presidents in the past, Dick Lyman and Don Kennedy, both of whom liked the idea but couldn't see any way to do it, was to stop teaching the stuff that we taught in a form that came down from Aristotle and was really suitable for the 19th century. Stanford is not even yet a 20th century university. It does not look at the 20th century situation and do anything. For example, the whole structure is around departments. The departments, there's not a single department in which you could solve a genuine big human problem because they lie across the departmental lines. But what they do is try and have interaction between the departments. The idea of reorganizing the entire university and using it as a model to reorganize education down through High, through elementary school and high school, it's the power of our administration to even think about. And the Finns are already doing it. Stanford University can't catch up educationally with a Finnish middle school. And as a result, we have people who don't understand exponential growth, who don't know what an ecosystem service is, have no idea of the history of near misses using nuclear weapons. It's not that there aren't people at Stanford who know that stuff and are working hard to change things, but the organization as a whole, the institution, is an ancient thing, which I think I quoted maybe in that article, is so busy oiling the parts that it's not thinking where the engine is going.
So yeah, if I could jump in, really what you're talking about, this sounds like intersectionality. And this is something that this is kind of a newer, for me at least, this is a newer concept. It's starting to enter the headlines. I've been hearing about this more and more frequently, but it is incredibly intriguing because, as you've mentioned, a lot of these issues, especially the intractable ones, the things that make them such a challenge are that they lie across the boundaries of different specializations. And so the intersectionality is being able to say, okay, we need to incorporate pieces from X, Y, and Z, and they all need to work together to solve this issue.
That's right. You also need specialization. I don't want an English major operating on my brain, but in part of that specialization, for instance, one of my great interests is medicine as it's practiced, and various aspects of it that don't pay enough attention to what we know about evolution. But it's really important that all the way through school, people who are going to be trained in specialties get the breadth and get to understand what the overall big problems are. Too many kids are peering at their cell phones and wanting to be computer specialists. So they think that the world is going to be run in the future by computers. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're even going to get to that stage. We're far enough into it now to know that it's likely to destroy us.
Yeah.
Stanford pioneered in what was called artificial intelligence, and the person who was the leader of it was the best example we ever saw of natural stupidity. There's huge issues connected with, for example, the fact that computer science is one of the leading specializations in a major university, where people don't have the slightest idea how their life support systems work, how to, even the computer people don't seem to understand exponential growth. It's quite astonishing. But
Yeah.
then again, I've got plans to miss all this.
Well, Paul, on that note, let me thank you again so much for your time today. It has been a true honor. And let me try and close on an optimistic note. I mean, we do have a lot of large pressing issues going on, but it appears that things like climate change, overpopulation have more recognition now than in the past. And it seems like public awareness is growing, especially in terms of conservation and renewable resources. Can we look at those as maybe at least the inklings of positive change?
I look at the kids who care about change and I say, I hope they're going to take over and they're going to make the change. Keep my fingers crossed.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, thank you again, sir.
It's been my pleasure. Take care.